Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101, and this is for our class for Tuesday, July 18th. And as you know, last class we introduced the class and I talked a little bit about the syllabus and the course outline. And today I wanted to talk about some of the textbook. And I'm hopeful you were able to get a hold of the textbook. That said, I had ordered the 18th edition, but you could use any of the earlier or later editions. There also is a copy of the textbook at the GCC library that you can access as well. And I also realized that you may not have been able to get a textbook for this particular class, so that I've incorporated that into some of what I will be talking about today. And what I wanted to do was to give you a sense of the three upcoming speeches that you are going to be delivering over the course of the semester. You can see in the notes below, and I'll always have notes below our class videos, that there are three graded speeches. This is in section 2 under speeches. Your first speech, which is something that you want to begin thinking about now, your autobiographical speech. That will be due on July 30th. As you know, this is a highly condensed class, even more so than your typical summer class. So on Thursday, the 30th, I'm going to ask you to upload a 5-minute autobiographical speech about yourself that tells the audience a little something about you and your life. Lots of different ways you could proceed with this. You could think of it as a springboard of the attendance question that I had asked last class to have you introduce yourself to your peers. And some of you might elect to do a life overview. Now, you've got only 5 minutes or so, so obviously you're going to pick and choose those elements that you think are most important or that you feel most comfortable sharing with your audience. Perhaps you wanted to focus on a particular topic, such as a hobby of yours or some sort of educational goal. I usually tell students that if you don't know what to talk about, you might want to talk about your educational history, your educational present, or your goals for your educational future, because that's something that we all share. And since all three speeches could be connected to one another, not that they have to be, you could elaborate on something that you examine in speech 1, in speech 2, or in speech 3. What I'm going to ask you to do is to record a video of that speech, much like I record these class sessions, and I will give you instructions on how to go about doing that and uploading that to Moodle when we get a little bit closer to the due date. And that said, you also will be writing a speaking outline, which we will talk a little bit more about next class, about taking key ideas and thoughts and listing them so that you can access them when you are delivering your speech. But you don't want to be reading your outline. You want to have some communication with your audience. Again, since this is an online class, you probably aren't speaking to an audience per se. You're speaking to a camera. But the idea is that the viewer should feel as if you are speaking to them. And we'll talk about different ways that you could proceed with that. And I wanted to take a quick peek at your outline and give you a sense from my perspective of places where I thought you might be able to improve. I asked you to send that outline to my email address, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu, so that I can review it and I will evaluate it informally on a checkmark system that ranges from excellent to very good to good and so forth. Now, speech number 2 won't be due until the 6th of August, and that is going to be on a Tuesday. By that point, you should have all had the experience of delivering your first speech. Part of the purpose of the first speech is to allow you to incorporate some of the textbook ideas and suggestions into delivering a speech. And also, part of the goal of the first speech is so that the class can get to know each other a little bit better. Well, now that that's out of the way, so to speak, that on the 6th you will be delivering an informative speech, happens to be my personal favorite, where you get to give a 10-minute informative speech that teaches the audience something. So it could be about something that you discussed in your autobiographical speech, but it could be something completely new. It could be something that you already have expertise in, or if you always wanted to learn about something, this could be the opportunity for you to learn about it. It could be about something that you have learned about or are learning about in class. The idea is that you get to be a teacher, in effect. And even though you have only 10 minutes, you'd be surprised how much information you can offer in 10 minutes. And for this speech, you're going to be required to use an audio or a visual, which we will talk about in greater depth. Certainly, that doesn't preclude you from using an audio or visual from the first speech, but I wanted you to concentrate just on speech delivery and not have to worry about audio visuals if you weren't comfortable with that. Certainly, if you know anything about teaching, you know about the different modalities that oftentimes teachers use and the different learning styles that students have. It's one of the reasons why, in addition to oral communication, giving information, you'll oftentimes have teachers offer visual information, for instance, such as the notes at the bottom of my video. Or it could be a video that's talking about content, or it could be an audio, of course. It could be a piece of music. So there are lots of possibilities, from doing things like charts and graphs to doing things like using props. And everything in between. I stopped counting after the first. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but there's nothing to preclude you from beginning to think about speech number 2, though your focus should be on speech 1. And then finally, we end the semester with the third speech, probably the most challenging of the speeches, a persuasive speech. That will be due on the 13th, on Tuesday, where you're trying to convince your audience to either take an action or support a position, or both. And for that speech, you have 15 minutes. Chances are you'll be incorporating elements of the autobiographical speech, speaking about yourself, but also elements about the informative speech, giving information, since your audience will need that. And for this speech, you'll need to use 3 outside sources. Again, nothing precluding you from using outside sources in the first 2 speeches. But again, what I'm trying to do is to divide up the speeches into pieces so that you are basically concentrating on different areas over the course of the semester. So by that point, we'll talk about ways that you can gather outside information and incorporate that within a speech that's oral rather than a paper that's written. And once again, you would be submitting in outlines for speech 2 and speech 3 to my email, which I would return back to you. So that gives you a little bit of an idea about the speeches. Now, I skipped section 1, which I wanted to visit now in the notes below, about plagiarism. That was a piece in the syllabus that I had not discussed, where basically plagiarism is taking somebody else's language or ideas and not giving credit to them. Basically presenting that information as if it were your own. And it's a pretty serious academic offense, comparable to thievery. But what you're doing is you're stealing intellectual property rather than physical property. And the consequences can be significant. From failing a class to even being expelled from the college with a notation on your transcript that you were expelled because of plagiarism. So it's certainly something you don't want to do. And I used to give a couple of short stories to encourage students not to plagiarize. One had actually happened to me. This was in the early 90s, pre-internet days, and I'm reading a student paper that sounds familiar. I can't rely on the internet because, again, the internet had not evolved to the point that we think of it now. But I very quickly recognized the information. It was from our own class textbook, actually, with passages lifted, with a few errors. I don't know if that was either to deceive me or they were just a sloppy plagiarist. The better story, which did not occur to me but was in all the academic newspapers, and there are such things as academic newspapers, also around the same time period, a middle-aged professor, that part being important, reading a set of papers and comes across something that sounds familiar. And as the middle-aged professor begins to mull where he had read this before he realized that he hadn't read it. He had written it himself decades earlier as an undergraduate. It was one of his old college papers, believe it or not. I know the odds are highly unlikely, but nevertheless, that's what occurred. And it had something to do with the fraternity that was recycling old papers from former fraternity members, and then usually I'd end my little speech about talking about as many resources as exist to help students plagiarize. An equal number exists to help teachers determine if they're plagiarizing, such as Turnitin.com, one of my personal favorites. Type in a sentence or a paragraph and then do an electronic search for the original source. Obviously, things have changed with artificial intelligence and continue to change almost daily. I encourage you not to use artificial intelligence in this class. Notice that I'm not suggesting you not use artificial intelligence. I'm suggesting you not use artificial intelligence in this class for a whole host of reasons. From the pretty traditional academic reason that you want to learn how to do something on your own rather than having to rely on an external source, to the fact that artificial intelligence is not foolproof, and there have been enough stories to illustrate that. One a few months ago about an attorney who relied on artificial intelligence for his court brief and found out that artificial intelligence was supplying him with court cases that were fictionalized. So, not that he knew that. And the judge figured it out by actually looking up the information. So I've heard terms like artificial intelligence has the ability to perhaps have some sort of a hallucination, which I find fascinating language because that implies some sort of element of sentience, which is also problematic with artificial intelligence. If you've ever seen a film like The Terminator, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But nevertheless, whether artificial intelligence is just mistaken or whether it is deliberately trying to mislead, it just can't be trusted as foolproof. And then lastly, there are some moral and economic implications that we as a society really haven't grappled with about what happens if artificial intelligence does become mainstream, and what will that do, for instance, to the workforce, and will it make many employees obsolete? And I think the problem with artificial intelligence is not the technology, but the speed that we are experiencing things that usually take place over decades over the course of days. And certainly the artificial intelligence I'm talking about today will not be the artificial intelligence that exists at the ending of this very short 5-week semester. So I encourage you, for all of those reasons and more, to basically rely on yourself so that you have skills in speaking that you've developed that are incorporated within your mind, not within the mind of a machine, assuming a machine can have a mind. So that's my little plagiarism speech. So, you may or may not have heard of an international organization by the name of Toastmasters that is related to public speaking, because they help their members improve their public speaking skills without having to worry about the stress associated with evaluative grades, for instance, that you would find in an academic classroom. And it's something that I highly recommend if you have access to it. And there are branches throughout the United States, actually internationally. And the reason why I mention them is because they had produced a video. Granted, it's somewhat dated at this point, but they had produced a video a couple decades ago where they had talked about the process of delivering a speech, which includes writing the preparation as well as the delivery. It's a 35-minute video that I was able to find for free on YouTube that I'm going to ask you to watch, especially if you haven't had an opportunity to do the textbook reading yet, because the video basically summarizes the major points that we are going to be talking about over the semester. It talks about the informative speech and the need for it to be clear and concise, the persuasive speech. Sometimes you need to motivate your audience in order order to be persuaded to take a position or an action, and that using emotional appeals can be very effective. And they talk about something called an entertaining speech, where you give stories and humor. We're not necessarily giving an entertaining speech, but we are giving an autobiographical speech, where I think it's more than appropriate to use stories and humor. In fact, I would suggest that stories and humors might be appropriate for all speeches. And they emphasize the importance of practice, as we will as well. That the more you prepare and the more you practice, the smoother your speech will go. And in terms of preparation, thinking about some of the most obvious things like the logistics and the location and the audience. And of course, you already know who your audience is. They're your classmates and myself. That already gives you a certain level of advantage, by the way, and that you know that you can gear your speech towards adults. So the assumption is that everyone enrolled in a college class is an adult, or at least will be treated as an adult, regardless of their age. The logistics we've talked about, that you are going to have to record your speeches, much like I'm recording my classes and uploading them onto Moodle. I will be providing a space on Moodle for you to be posting your first speech, your second speech, and your third speech, so that your classmates can view those speeches as well. And the location, that's something for you to think about since you are recording. Where are you going to record this speech? And ultimately, I know that we all have different situations and we all have access to different kinds of venues, but you want a background that's not too busy. And you want a background that ultimately the audience will be focusing on you. My background, for instance, happens to be my living room, which I thought was fairly appropriate, in that I don't think it's too busy, and ultimately it's a place where I have a certain level of comfort. Your objective, and you might say that's easy. You told me it's an informative speech or a persuasive speech. There can be many reasons why you're delivering a speech, as we will talk about shortly. You could be delivering a speech as a kind of confessional, let's say, in your autobiographical speech, or as a attempt to persuade or to impress an audience member that you want to impress. So there are lots of reasons for delivering speeches. I obviously want to give you practice in delivering speeches and also speaking in front of a camera. Your speech will be somewhat similar to writing a paper, and my assumption is that you've had experience with that. It's one of the reasons why 101 is a prerequisite. You'll have an introduction, which is where you greet your audience and you give your thesis, your main point. You'll have a discussion section. Sometimes in English classes we call it a body section, where you give your evidence and your details. And then you have a conclusion, and this is where you give closure and you say farewell to your audience. And the introduction and conclusion are particularly important, especially when you are delivering something that's oral, because you might be somewhat anxious and you might just fly through an intro or completely omit it. And the same might happen with the conclusion. You need to give the audience some sort of cue that things are over. It could be as simple as saying thank you, as we will discuss. And then, of course, the presentation, that you want to be conversational. And yes, you want to use a speaking outline, but you want to refer to that speaking outline as minimally as possible so that you can keep eye contact with the audience or the camera. My speaking outline actually for this video is based on the notes below. So I've got a written copy of that. I like having written copies of things, so in the event that there's some sort of technological failure, I can still rely on my written notes. And these notes that I've provided at the bottom of my video are basically the notes that help guide me as to what I should be discussing. And you want to think about things like body language, whether you want a full body shot or if you want to be seated somewhere the way I am. Your vocal inflections, as we will discuss further as the semester progresses. You don't want to be at a monotone. You want to make sure that your volume is audible. You want to use pauses. One of my greatest challenges. I tend to speak quickly. And the idea of using a pause is not only to give you a moment to collect your thoughts, but it also gives the audience a moment to collect their thoughts. It can also increase drama and intrigue, and anticipating what an audience might ask. Again, not that you're speaking to a live audience, but if you can address those questions, you will address the viewers' questions. And certainly, if the audience is asking you questions, you want to be as prepared as possible, just like when you prepare before a job interview, hopefully, about the sorts of things that you might be asked. So do watch that video, again, approximately 35 minutes or so. In terms of the chapters that I had assigned today, I assigned chapter 1, at least in the edition that I'm using, and it's entitled Speech and Higher Ed. It talks about some of the reasons why public speaking is a component of a liberal arts education and oftentimes a degree requirement. And what you'll see is that the textbook introduces you to terminology, just like many 101 kinds of classes do. So you might be familiar with the concepts, but not necessarily familiar with the language of that particular discipline. The intellectual imperative, as they call it, and the textbook was nice enough to bold some of these terms, means that one of the reasons why you want to study public speaking is just because you want to be a well-educated individual, for the very same reasons why you study history and literature and why you study science and math. There is also something called a social imperative that I've become more and more interested in, that as time has progressed, that we are required to have human interaction with one another. This is a good thing. I think about the early days of COVID when we couldn't have interaction with one another. So I feel quite grateful that we've returned to something like a sense of normalcy in that way. But basically, whether you interact through technology or you interact face to face or some combination thereof, which is where most of us are now, there are many reasons why you are going to need to be able to communicate with one or several or many people. So you want practice doing that. There also is the consumer imperative, and I too have become increasingly interested in that as an audience member, as a listener or a viewer, you are consuming information and you want to be as critical and analytical about it as possible. And you want to hold the person who is giving you that information to the same standards you would hold yourself if you were presenting that information. I've oftentimes said that public speaking is not an easy class, in the sense that while we learn techniques, that we in the real world oftentimes see individuals who don't follow those techniques or perhaps even violate them. It oftentimes happens in the political arena, for instance, and these individuals are rewarded with money, with power, with position. And I would suggest that we should hold these individuals accountable, that if they can't be clear, if they can't defend their arguments, if they can't be civil, then there should be an accountability there, rather than our assuming that they can do something that we would never do when we were delivering something in a academic context for public speaking. Now, public speaking is circular. Usually people focus on the idea that I have to be a speaker and give a message. But don't forget your audience. And your audience, and a live audience certainly, will give feedback. And a good public speaker can read their audience, read the crowd, so to speak, and adjust accordingly. Again, there are some challenges involved when you are recording a speech, but I know that sometimes students will ask family and friends to sit as audience when they are delivering their speech, just so that things don't feel so artificial. And I think about, again, the early days of COVID. I'll never forget reading a news article about a professor who is accustomed to giving large lecture classes. And obviously, those were no longer in place with COVID. This professor had to record his classes. And what he did was he lined up a series of stuffed animals in the front row of the lecture hall so that he could speak to something. And he found it to be actually quite useful. So whatever it is that you need to do, I've often said that it's smoke and mirrors. Acting is as much a component of delivering a speech as is the content. And always think about ethos, which sounds like ethics because it's about credibility. We want to hold ourselves to the highest ethical standards. And again, I'm quite aware that there are other public speakers who don't, and we should hold them accountable. So chapter 2 is about getting started, which is what you're doing. You're getting started. I encourage you to think long and hard over the weekend about possibilities for speech 1, though you might want to contemplate speech 2 and speech 3 as well. You need to select and narrow the topic. So for your first speech, the autobiographical speech, you know you're speaking about yourself, but what is it that you're going to be sharing? What are you going to be comfortable sharing? You can self-disclose a lot or self-disclose a little, depending on your comfort level. And what would be appropriate for your audience? The purpose, again, is so everyone in the class can get to know one another a little bit better. And it's also so that you can practice some of the speech delivery skills that we will be discussing and have already discussed. But you might have different purposes. Again, you might see the autobiographical speech as an opportunity to share some personal information about yourself that you think is important to share. But think about the primary purpose. Again, this is a graded venue. Analyzing your audience and the occasion, and I have a funny story about this. It's actually a true story that happened to one of my colleagues at another institution, I won't tell you which, and they were a public speaking teacher and listening to a speech by one of their students who was talking about a very philosophical concept, being true to oneself. And as the speech progressed, believe it or not, the student began to disrobe. And ultimately, the teacher intervened before this student could disrobe to the point where it would be inappropriate, and asked the student what was happening. And the student said, well, if this speech is about being true to yourself, I want to show you the true me. And of course, the teacher halted it right there. I think this student's intent was basically to get nude in class. Obviously, the student did not think about the audience or the occasion, that would be inappropriate. So don't do things like that. Gathering material. Now, the first speech is about something that you know very well, yourself. So my assumption is you won't need to gather material, but use this as an opportunity to interview family, friends, look up things like Ellis Island records if you so wanted to. Not that you have to, but certainly you could if you wanted to. Making a speaking outline, and that's something we're going to talk about more in depth next class. My hope is that by next week you will have access to the textbook. There's an entire chapter devoted just to writing outlines. And for public speaking, I can give you a spoiler here. Less is more when you're writing an outline. Practicing out loud, and certainly I encourage you to practice. And if you wanted to practice with me, you can always make an appointment, or if you wanted to do something via email and show me things like drafts of your outline, I'm happy to do so. And then finally, delivering the speech itself. And in terms of delivery, because we are working with technology, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, you want to sort of think about what would happen if there were technological difficulties. As you've probably seen, I try to record these videos early, the day before they're supposed to be posted, so that I've got plenty of time to post it, so I could try to prevent technological difficulties. Of course, you can't necessarily prevent all possibilities, but I try my hardest, and I suggest you do so as well, especially when the stakes are so high. Teaching a class is one thing, but I teach multiple classes. Delivering one speech for a grade is quite another. So you want to make sure that you have accommodated enough time and enough practice so that you can avoid as many glitches or difficulties as possible. And then finally, the last chapter that I had assigned today, because I'd like you to spend the next part of this watching that 35-minute video or so, is about critical listening. And people oftentimes forget about the importance of listening to the speeches of others, particularly as a learning exercise. Not only are you going to be delivering your own speech, but you are going to be listening to the speeches of your classmates. I too am going to be providing some examples of sample autobiographical, informative, and persuasive speeches that have been posted online, and no one associated with GCC, so you don't need to worry that one day your speech will be posted online. And that's really one of the best ways to learn how to deliver a speech, is to watch the way that other people deliver their speeches, so you can determine what pieces are effective or ineffective when you put together your own speech. And there is a difference between hearing, the processing of sound, which is what most people can do, unless they've got some sort of a disability or some sort of a challenge, as opposed to listening, which is actually paying attention. So if you've ever been in the situation where someone has asked you something and you're not able to respond because, yes, you were hearing what they said, but you weren't listening to what they said. I can admit this has happened to me more than once with my own husband, who maintains that he's listening, and then when I ask him, perhaps he wasn't listening as carefully as he could have been. Again, you want to think about your audio, so this means that you're going to have to think about your recording equipment. I usually tell students to assume that someone in their audience is at least hard of hearing, and it's a definite in PCS 101 because I'm the hard of hearing one. Of course, we can use technology to raise volume, but you want to think about things like, is your lighting sufficient so that we can see you? We want to be able to focus on your face and your facial expressions, because so much is communicated through facial expressions. We want to make sure that we can hear you and there aren't distracting outside noises, things of that nature. And there are lots of barriers to paying attention. Sometimes it has nothing to do with environment. Sometimes it's what the textbook calls the internal perceptual field. You might know it better as daydreaming, where one thought leads to another, leads to another. And it's one of the reasons why teachers encourage students to take notes, is to keep you on task so that you don't start daydreaming. There also is the external perceptual field, the environment. Things like lighting and audio and temperature and all of the rest. And sometimes you can control your environment, and sometimes you can't control your environment. But certainly you want to try to control it to be as audience friendly as possible within the confines that you might have. And there are questions you can even ask yourself when you're listening to speeches. In fact, many of these questions are useful questions to ask yourself when you are putting together your speech. The textbook offers you some. And also, if you'll remember our syllabus and other documents folder, I have a speech rating sheet that's uploaded there along with your syllabus and your outline. So this will give you an idea of the sorts of questions I'll be asking when I review speeches. So these are the kinds of questions you can be asking when you are reviewing the speeches of your peers, or the questions you can ask yourself when you are basically creating your own speech. And I'll talk about those questions further as the semester progresses. So basically what's left is our class discussion forum question. And I wanted to deal with the elephant in the room, which is about nervousness. And most people would feel a certain level of nervousness having to deliver a speech either to a camera or to an audience, or both. And even trained entertainers will say that they oftentimes feel nervousness. That's not a bad thing. It means that you've got a certain emotional, intellectual investment in the activity. But you certainly don't want nervousness to interfere with your ability to create and perform in terms of public speaking. So the textbook gives some suggestions, but my suspicion is that you've probably dealt with this before and you may have your own techniques. So whether based on what the textbook has suggested or based on your own experiences and techniques, no matter how eccentric they might sound, what suggestions do you have to control nervousness? What suggestions do you have to control nervousness? And again, you're not required to respond to your peers. I encourage you to, much like I encourage you to participate in class if this were a live class. Some of you would elect to do that, some of you wouldn't. But you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn, because I'm going to be reading all of these attendance form questions and responding. So then that'll give you a good idea of different ways that you could approach nervousness. You have 48 hours to answer this attendance question. So if our class is at 9 a.m. on Thursday, though you might be watching this earlier, then that would mean that you've got up until the Saturday to submit in your response to the attendance questions, so that hopefully everybody knows that by Sunday they can access their peer responses, and shortly thereafter my responses in turn. So I will leave you to watching the Toastmasters video, where they also do talk about nervousness, by the way, but not as much as I would have liked. So I encourage you to think about it, and certainly to write about it. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about the textbook and how to prepare for speech 1, but also thinking in the back of our mind about speech 2 and speech 3. Take care. Bye-bye.